Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. And what brings you here today? Made in America? And what brings me here today is about our medicines not being made in America. So I'm going to tell you a story. It was a journey that I took for about 3 years to figure out, so where do our medicines that we rely on every day for infections and for other conditions, where do they come from? And it turns out we're importing, and we're so dependent on China for many of them. So come with me on this journey, and they're documented in China RX. And so here we go. Come along for the ride. So I bet a lot of you are taking medicines, or you have family members who do. And they come in these orange bottles with those white caps that can be hard to open. And you never see country of origin, right? Where they come from. You see them on food labels, but do we see them on our medicines? Nowhere to be found. This is China RX with a big red pill on it. This is an untold story, and it took years to uncover so we can inform the American people and tell about this huge health security risk and risks to our national security, to our country. Here's what happened. Here's how it happened. And you'll understand this because you're at this Made in America conference. Back in the 1980s, the United States, Europe, and Japan, we made medicines here. And we made the intel inside, the ingredients that make our medicine. And we sold them around the world. Fast forward, where are we now? China, very smart industrial policy and good for its people, but they gained control over 80% of the core ingredients in our prescription drugs and selling them to the world. What does that mean for us? I'm sure many of you have taken penicillin for ear infections or strep throat. You've given them to your kids. Or if you haven't, maybe you know people that do. I'm going to show you 2 slides that describe in a nutshell why we're no longer making penicillin anymore. It's an incredible story. The last penicillin plant in the United States closed. It was up in New York, Bristol-Myers Squibb. It closed in 2004. And why did that happen? Here's the story. And I want to thank some really great people in the industry in Europe that shared this information with me, because it's really hard to find. You got to dig really deep. And here's what they showed me. And this is what I call China's penicillin cartel, and it really was a cartel. And it's emblematic of the playbook that China uses to undercut so many industries, not just our medicines, but so many other industries like steel. So this is a really public interested group that were very helpful to me while writing China RX. It's a European fine chemicals group. They make the pharmaceutical chemicals that comprise our medicines. And look what they talked about, the 25-year landslide in what happened to their business. And I'm sure for some of you in this audience, this will sound really familiar. This is what happened globally, not only to European producers, but also to American producers. So I'm going to show you a busy slide. You don't have to see all the details, but just to let you know that there's real evidence here that opens our eyes about what happened to our medicine. So here's what happened. China very smartly has an industrial policy, and it has one in medicines, and so they invested heavily in these huge plants to make the raw material for penicillin and our other antibiotics. And they began selling it on the global market. It's very interesting what happened. You can see global growth of penicillin material production and increasing China's share. But around 2004, what they did was they suddenly lowered their price, and they kept it low for several years. And what happened? That drove out all the US, European, and even Indian producers of the key material to make this really important antibiotic. And then when they were all gone, prices went back up. This is the playbook and wiping out an industry. China was very smart, and we here in the United States, we let it go. We got to find a way to bring some basic level of our manufacturing capability back to the United States. If you don't have antibiotics, people will die. We have virtually no manufacturing capability left in the United States to make generic antibiotics. That means that we cannot make the medicines to treat anthrax exposure. Remember the anthrax attacks in 2001? The federal government needed to buy 20 million doses of this really important antibiotic called doxycycline. It's also used if you have Lyme disease. Some people take that antibiotic for that condition. The US government had to go to a European plant that in turn had to get the raw material from a plant in China. Strep throat, ear infections, urinary tract infections, pneumonia, if you have an infection in your mouth, STDs, and so much more. We cannot make the basic medicines to treat these common conditions in the United States of America. That needs to change. If you're like me, you might take vitamins. I used to take a vitamin C. There's an incredible story here about China's vitamin C cartel, and it really was and is a cartel. Here's what happened. Same playbook. We had a bunch of producers here in the US and Europe and elsewhere making ascorbic acid. That's what makes vitamin C vitamin C. And so a handful of Chinese companies, they dumped it on the global market. And you know what happens. All the Western producers, all global producers went out of business. Now this is where it really gets interesting. So this was happening in the early 2000s, right around the time that the penicillin cartel was happening. It's fascinating. I watched and tracked. Once we opened up free trade with China in 2000, and they joined the WTO, that's when I noticed our landslide really beginning in earnest. That's when we lost the last penicillin plant. That's when we lost even our ability to make aspirin. That plant, last aspirin plant in the US closed in 2002. And then the vitamin C cartel around that same period. Who knew that trade policy would affect something so important, that's so life and death as our medicines? So here's what happened with the vitamin C cartel. A small group of US-based companies went to court saying this is a violation of antitrust. And these were animal feed producers. They were not the pharma companies. And so they sued the Chinese companies in federal court in Brooklyn, and a very smart jury said, yeah, this is a violation of US antitrust law. That's a big problem. So yeah, they're guilty. And there's a $150 million settlement imposed on the Chinese companies, and we thought that was that. Not so. The Chinese companies appealed that court decision. And those smart people in Brooklyn who said, yeah, this is a problem. But what was their argument? And this shows where we are in an economic war. The argument of the Chinese companies and the Chinese government in US federal court was that we required our companies, as a matter of Chinese law, to fix prices, to control the prices of the product we sell to the United States, and to control supply as a matter of Chinese law. So what did the Federal Appeals Court do in New York? Their decision came out, and they overturned the jury verdict. They said we can't expect Chinese companies to abide by Chinese law and US law simultaneously. That effectively allows Chinese cartels to operate with impunity in the United States and undermine everything we know about our economic system. And for so many years, the Department of Justice did nothing. It sat on the sidelines, did not protect American businesses, and did not protect American consumers who saw the price of ascorbic acid went up about 600% when China drove out all the Western companies. And vitamin C is in everything. It's fortified in cereals and hamburger buns and fruit juices. It's a big problem. It wasn't until a couple years ago that, with help of a different Justice Department, that the businesses appealed to the Supreme Court, saying the lower court put too much emphasis on what China said, that it was a matter of law. Because that really is in question. Was it really a matter of Chinese law? And so now it's back at the appeals court, and we'll see what happens. But you see the strategy to use our judicial system to undermine our entire economic system. And I have to ask the question, where were all the supporters of a free market who called for opening up for free trade with China when this decision was rendered, legitimizing cartels in the United States of America? They're nowhere to be found. Using the same playbook, China has gained global control over 80% of the essential ingredients to make prescription drugs. Now, some people will say, well, what about India? India makes a lot of generic drugs, and that's true, exactly right. But one of the surprising things I found while working on China RX is that even India is dependent on China for 80% of the key ingredients it needs for its giant generic industry. So what we have here is a real narrow supply for the world. We wouldn't have China or any other country control 80% of the world's oil, would we? We wouldn't have China or any other country control 80% of the supply of wheat. Nor should we allow it for medicine. At the end of July, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission held a really landmark hearing, and I give them great credit for putting this issue out there. And the U.S. Department of Defense official testified, and here's in part what he said. The national security risks of increased Chinese dominance of the global active pharmaceutical ingredient API market cannot be overstated. The men and women in uniform and our veterans are dependent on China, just like the rest of us. During the DoD's testimony, one of the commissioners spoke up. Dr. Larry Wurtzel, he's a 32-year veteran Army colonel. He taught in the Army War College. He was head of the Strategic Studies Institute there, and he described, and this was the most powerful part of that whole hearing, he described how he got 3 different recalls of his blood pressure medicine. They were made in India, but the ingredient came in from China, and it had rocket fuel in it. When you lose control over the supply of medicine, you lose control over the quality. I'm sure some of you have heard about the recalls of the blood pressure medicines that had carcinogens in them. I bet some people in this room have gotten that. I see hands raised. How the heck did carcinogens get in blood pressure medicine? Well, I did a deep dive on that, and here's what happened. Generic competition lowers price. You've heard that? What does that do to manufacturers? We're in a room full of people making things. When you hammer down on price too hard, what happens? You cut corners and quality suffers. That's exactly what we're doing to our medicines. And what happened in this case is there was a Chinese company that when the drug went off patent and it was available in generic form, it wanted to get a large share of that global market. So it wanted to find a cheaper way to make it. So it came up with a new chemical process. It was great chemistry, solved the problem. But nobody was thinking, well, gee, this is going to be consumed by humans. This has carcinogen in it. We probably shouldn't be using it. When the FDA finally went in to inspect this plant, they saw that the company knew that it had a problem. And it was delivering substandard products to American consumers and consumers around the world. And didn't do anything. It didn't go back and find the root cause and fix it. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, the FDA should do its job. That seems reasonable. But you know what the problem is? If you're hammering down on price too much, and the good guys are getting out, and you're left with people cutting corners, how do you fix that market? By regulation, by inspection. You can only inspect what they're producing. It's like if you and I go to the mall this weekend, and we're looking for the cheapest t-shirt. We can go out and find the cheapest possible t-shirt, save 25 cents. Bring it home. After a couple months, and the washing machine starts falling apart, we'll go out and buy another one. No federal regulator can regulate my purchasing behavior. That's why the FDA is in a pickle. They're having to make trade-offs between substandard drugs and drug shortages because of what's happening in the marketplace. I had the privilege of testifying at the China Commission hearing, saying we wouldn't outsource the manufacture of our aircraft carriers or nuclear submarines to China. We shouldn't be doing that for our medicines. We need to think of our medicines not as a cheap commodity, but as a strategic asset, like we do oil, like we do food. We're talking about life and death here. We're talking about last resort antibiotics. How dependent are we? This is from the CEO of a European company. He said if China shut the door on exporting ingredients to the US within 3 months, all the pharmacies would be empty. And this is why there's debate about tariffs. This is why the US-based industry said we don't want any tariffs on any pharmaceutical products when it comes to China. We'll raise prices and we might have shortages. It's acknowledgement of how dependent we are. Now, China's moving up the value chain, slowly, but they're coming into this country. Here's some generic drugs. I'm sure you know some people in your families who are taking them, being made in China by Chinese companies that are being sold here in the US. And this is a sign of the collapse of Western generic manufacturing. The antibiotic doxycycline, this is the label. We're importing chemotherapy drugs. If you know anyone undergoing cancer treatment, the chemotherapy might be made in China. Antidepressants. I tell young women, are your birth control pills coming from China? Might want to take a look. Medicine for Alzheimer's. HIV/AIDS, and much more. And just to go back for a second, I think it's just a matter of time before the Western companies will be out of business, 5 or 10 years. There's just a handful of Western generic drug makers left. And earlier this year, they announced that they're dropping about half their products because they can't compete. It's not just us that's dependent. Take a look at Europe. This was a documentary done by Dutch public television. I give them a lot of credit for their transparency and honesty. And they put it out there where we are. So even Europe is dependent, Australia, Canada. This is what happens when you have the centralization of a supply chain in a single country. This is a quote from a former industry official. He says, "Now we're afraid that China will do things to deprive us of our medication." And they're not in a trade kerfuffle with China. Think of what control over medicine does, the political and economic leverage. Medicines can be used as a weapon. You can withhold them, just like food was in World War I and World War II, change the outcome. We're seeing generic companies, manufacturing plants here closing down. It's a plant in West Virginia with 3,000 people. I'm really worried about those workers. When you control medicines, you control the world. Think of the leverage when you have a Chinese president talking to a US president, whoever it might be, and say, well, we could withhold antibiotics if you don't do something. And again, the FDA, they can't fix this problem. It's just too big. And the results are real. The impact is real. Quality is a problem. This is a Johns Hopkins trained physician who walked into a prominent hospital one day. And I won't go into the whole story. It's in China RX. But within 24 hours, he was in multiple organ failure because of contaminated heparin.
Rose?
Yes,
Rose?
sir. Yes, sir.
Just give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up something live for you here real quick. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Don Buckner wanted us to show you guys something real quick, and you're doing a beautiful job.
We use a single-level direct marketing sales program to use military rank structure to give team, mission, purpose, and accountability back. These teams is what the veterans starves for, and now we're bringing teams back.
And hiring only veterans,
We'll
right?
have a sales force completely made of veterans.
Amazing.
They get unique codes, and we build them up. This is our Command Sergeant Major.
Yeah, and one of the cool things that this company does is they have the squad leaders directly communicate with the veteran team members because transitioning from military life to civilian life can be difficult.
Yeah, that's where we're losing these guys is the transition process back from the military back into civilian life. So we've structured just like the military. They come on, they get a squad leader assigned to them.
Yeah.
And then we have a Monday morning muster where we
Right.
do. The squad leader calls their team and says, "Hey guys, where you at? How's your head?
Amazing.
What's your family doing?" It's called the Monday morning muster.
Now, really quickly, what is your website if you want more information?
ScarsandStripesCoffee.com.
Okay, and you are relaunching in November, I hear.
We are going to have a website
Amazing.
that's going to revolutionize.
All right, so a lot of patriotism here at this conference. You guys are doing incredible work. I'm going to go shop around, maybe bring back some Scars and Stripes coffee for the Fox and Friends team. How about that?
Bring it back.
I'll send it back to you in the studio.
Thanks, Carly.
Thanks,
We'd love
Carly.
to try it tomorrow morning. Looks a lot different than any Command Sergeant Major.
So, Rose, I wanted to apologize for that, but listen, it's not very often that Fox has actually dedicated some time for us. It's just really amazing, and we're really blessed with that. So I just want to go ahead and let you understand how important it is for our medication, right? Because what I understand is the last recall for blood pressure medication for the vets on the generic side, I believe, was because of China. Is that correct?
That's right. The largest producer of this contaminated drug and the worst perpetrator was a company in China. The amount of carcinogen in their blood pressure medicine was so off the charts that the FDA had to ban everything, all the products coming from that plant. And I'm happy with the interruption. That's great to have that attention to to good folks trying to bring jobs and prosperity back to America. So, Brad, that's perfectly fine. So just to round out here, what do we do? Where do we begin to solve this huge problem? And the good news is people are popping up. And here's what's happening. I'm happy to say that taking this from a national security angle, that's getting a lot of attention. And there are a lot of people looking at now at where we are vulnerable. We can't fix the problem until we know it. And so some are trying to do a deep dive right now to know exactly where we're vulnerable and to identify those medicines for which we're especially at risk. We need to bring some of that back home. We need a minimum, 20%, whatever it is, capacity here at home. So they're starting to look, and you can't fix the problem until we know about it, and they're starting to look. We need to allow the Department of Defense and VA to buy based on value, not cheap. Let's use our taxpayer money, not to send it over to China to grow their industry, but to keep our industry here at home and to assure high-quality, trustworthy medicines. Let's start thinking about the Defense Production Act to bring some of the manufacturing back home that the market itself won't do. Lots of opportunities to do that. We have incredible technology developed in this country to make medicines differently, but the market hasn't adopted it. We might be at an inflection point soon, and maybe a little help in a public-private partnership could get us back make the capital investment needed to make our medicines better, faster, cheaper, and even at lower cost to benefit all of us, military, civilians, veterans. And here's one. If you like Sunday morning bacon, smells good, turns out we might be getting that from Smithfield, which was bought by China a number of years ago for $7 billion. Smithfield is that venerable pork producer down in Smithfield, Virginia. We don't own it anymore. And there's hog farms all over the country that are part of Smithfield. Well, it turns out there's a part of pigs that's critical to making a really important medicine for our nation's hospitals and for people on kidney dialysis. If we don't have it, people will die. And right now there's a shortage of pigs in China because of this Africa swine fever virus that's decimating the pig population. We got to start thinking out of the box here. So one of the recommendations I put out there just to get our brains moving and thinking differently is let's have this Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States that reviews foreign investment in the U.S. and recommend that we require Smithfield to sell that company back to a U.S. owner, not for food security, but for national health security. So we got to think differently about all of this. So I'm just going to round it up here. I really appreciate your coming. I hope you'll spread the word here about the importance of bringing our medicine manufacturing back home. It will revive communities, give people jobs, restore parts of our country with economic prosperity, and increase our national health security and our national security. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking to you later. Thank you. Thank you. Hope you'll take it, run with it, share it with colleagues and friends. We got to know knowledge is power. This is a kitchen table issue. We can win it. Thank you.